Stone Cold Steve Austin's feud with The Rock is, in a word, legendary. Not only was the Texas Rattlesnake versus the People's Champ a box office hit, but the rivalry itself was what brought many new fans to the World Wrestling Federation. The no-nonsense blue-collar Stone Cold Steve Austin resonated with people around the world, while The Rock's confident demeanour and unmatched charisma drew fans towards the Great One. Austin and Rock were opposites in terms of character, both in their personal lives and on screen, but what they both had in common was the very real desire to be the number one guy in the WWF. It was as legitimate as it gets. The Rock once talked about how he saw Stone Cold sign autographs with number one beside his name, and it seriously fired the People's Champion up, feeling that Austin was getting a little ahead of himself by claiming he was the top guy at the time. So when The Rock stepped into the ring with Steve Austin at WrestleMania, the biggest yearly event the WWF produced, both men were trying to prove a point, and it was us fans who got rewarded the most. So good was The Rock versus Steve Austin at WrestleMania 15 that we got a further two WrestleMania matches featuring the Texas Rattlesnake and the People's Champion. Each match was vastly different from the other, and each match told a different story that, in a way, also tell the story of WWF's evolution through the Attitude Era and beyond. Today's video then will look at the Austin vs Rock WrestleMania Trilogy and the stories both men told in the ring. While the World Wrestling Federation Championship would play a key role throughout Austin's rivalry with The Rock, the feud found its beginnings with the Intercontinental Championship. Stone Cold had been feuding with Owen Hart over the IC title towards the end of '97, and due to the untimely end of the Hart Foundation, Owen took a break from the WWF, leaving Stone Cold without a dance partner. The Rock was making a name for himself in the Nation of Domination. Rocky's recent heel turn was going well thanks to Dwayne Johnson being given the opportunity to be himself, and so it made sense to give Rock a shot at the IC belt. The Intercontinental title was really a stepping stone for Steve Austin towards the WWF title, as it should be, and Stone Cold was getting prepared to win the WWF Championship at WrestleMania 14. The Rock would be given the IC title after a small feud with Austin that lasted a few months in late '97 and early '98. Austin had bigger fish to fry, while The Rock worked on establishing his new and brash character. Stone Cold Steve Austin won the WWF Championship at Mania 14, and the fabled Austin vs McMahon rivalry kicked off in 1998. Austin vs McMahon will have its own video in the future. I want to try to stick with The Rock vs Austin here, but in a nutshell, Vince McMahon didn't want his company represented by Stone Cold, and Vince would do everything to make Austin's life a living hell, but usually his plans backfired. Stone Cold would enjoy sticking it to the boss, and fans around the world couldn't wait to see how Austin would retaliate to McMahon's evil schemes. At the beginning of November of 1998 though, Vince started targeting another superstar, a superstar who called himself the People's Champion. The Rock had won the fans over with his catchphrases, his promos and his in-ring work. Dwayne Johnson was getting cheered more and more every week, and the WWF soon realised that they had a legitimate star rising up the ranks. Fans were gravitating towards The Rock, his crowd pops were only behind those of Stone Cold Steve Austin, and in storyline, Vince McMahon had a problem with The Rock being a man of the people. A tournament for the vacant WWF title was taking place at the 1998 Survivor Series, and Vince McMahon made The Rock's path to Survivor Series very difficult, but Rocky defied the odds, securing his spot in the tournament while the fans cheered in approval. The Rock was on track to becoming the WWF's latest big babyface. The decision to turn Rock heel once again after winning the WWF title at Survivor Series, I think, was a stroke of genius. It was one of the WWF's best swerves at the time, and I don't think anyone saw it coming. What you have to appreciate about this particular heel turn though was the risk involved. The Rock was legitimately becoming a main eventer, and it was his recent work as a good guy that catapulted him to the main event spot. It wasn't just a normal everyday heel turn though. You really have to appreciate the audience reactions Rocky Rocky was receiving in the run-up to Survivor Series. Never had a superstar been so accepted by fans in this fashion, and yet the WWF still went ahead and made Rocky a bad guy, even when his popularity was going into orbit. What I didn't understand then, and what we now know in hindsight, is that there was a bigger long-term plan with The Rock. This was all leading to WrestleMania 15, where The Rock would have to defend his WWF Championship against Stone Cold Steve Austin. I remember being a little miffed by the screwjob finish and the heel turn to end Survivor Series 98, but looking back now, it's one of my favourite moments of The Rock's career. It also reminds me of a time when the WWE didn't seem so creatively bankrupt. So, The Rock was no longer the people's champion, he was now the corporate champion. In order for Steve Austin to get a shot at the WWF Championship at WrestleMania, he had to win the 1999 Royal Rumble. The whole theme of the Rumble match in '99 was centered around Vince McMahon's corporation doing whatever they could to ensure Austin didn't win. Vince McMahon himself was in the Royal Rumble match, and a series of events led to Austin being the number one entrant and Vince McMahon being number two. A bounty was placed on Stone Cold Steve Austin also. The man who eliminated Austin would be $100,000 richer, so you can see here that the odds were very much stacked against the Texas Rattlesnake. Stone Cold and Vince McMahon battled around the arena. We thought the corporation had taken Austin out backstage in the middle of the Rumble match, but it all came down to Vince and Austin in the end, and thanks to a distraction caused by The Rock, Vince McMahon was able to win the Royal Rumble. The next night on Raw, Vince McMahon forfeited his right to face The Rock at WrestleMania, saying he would select the number one contender instead, but Commissioner Shawn Michaels said that according to WWF rules, the runner-up of the Royal Rumble is next in line for a title shot should there be a forfeit. So Stone Cold was named the number one contender. Steve Austin said he would put his number one contendership up for grabs if it meant he could face Vince McMahon in a match, and so Austin and Vince had a steel cage match at the St. Valentine's Day Massacre pay-per-view, a match that Austin won. So here we are at the first match, WWF Champion The Rock versus Stone Cold Steve Austin, the main event of WrestleMania 15. Rocky's first ever WrestleMania main event and Steve Austin's second. I'm not going to go over the match move for move and spot for spot like I would do for other videos, because I'm sure most of you have seen these matches before, and really, it's the theme and the tone of each individual WrestleMania match that sets them apart. This match told the story of Vince McMahon's clean-cut, good-looking corporate champion going up against the middle-class, hard-working Texas Rattlesnake. Vince McMahon felt that The Rock represented what a WWF champion should be, and in the run-up to WrestleMania, McMahon done everything possible to stop Steve Austin from once again rising to the top. Really, when you think about it, the WrestleMania 15 match maybe had more to do with McMahon versus Austin, but don't forget either that this was The Rock's first chance at headlining the biggest show of the year, and he done an excellent job. Commissioner Michaels made sure that the corporation were barred from ringside, and Shawn also stopped Vince McMahon from refereeing the bout, so the WrestleMania main event would be a fair one-on-one no disqualification match. When Rock and Austin started trading punches to start the match off, we knew we were in for a good main event here. The early portion of the match was spent outside the ring. The first image that comes to my head when I think of this match is Austin and Rocky battling beside the giant WrestleMania sign at the entranceway. But the match really heats up when things get back in the ring. After Austin kicks out of the Rock bottom, Mike Chioda gets wiped out when Rocky uses the referee to defend himself. Tim White and Earl Hebner eventually run down to officiate the match, but they too get taken out. Vince McMahon makes an appearance, and it looks like Austin is destined to lose this match, but Mick Foley shows up in his referee shirt, taking care of Vince McMahon and going on to officiate the match. The audience are on their feet for the final moments of the bout. Rocky hits another Rock bottom, and the great one goes for the people's elbow. Austin moves out of the way, the Rattlesnake fights out of another Rock bottom attempt, and the Stone Cold Stunner is delivered for the victory. Steve Austin wins the match as Vince McMahon looks on in disbelief, and the toughest SOB in the WWF delivers a Stone Cold Stunner to the boss to end WrestleMania 15. There's a great atmosphere in the arena for this main event. It's definitely worth a watch, but the Austin vs Rock WrestleMania Trilogy, I think, would only get better. After WrestleMania 15, The Rock would eventually leave the corporation and he would become the ultra-over superstar that he was always destined to become. Both Rocky and Austin coexisted in the WWF, but by and large they were kept away from each other in terms of angles and storylines. And along with this, Steve Austin took some time off to heal up injuries. At the end of the year 2000, Kurt Angle won the WWF Championship in the Armageddon Hell in a Cell match. At the 2001 Royal Rumble, Kurt was able to successfully defend his championship in a match with Triple H, so it looked like the winner of the 2001 Royal Rumble would face the Olympic gold medalist in the main event of WrestleMania 17. Both Steve Austin and The Rock were in the Rumble match, both men were babyfaces, and with guys like The Undertaker and Kane also being in the Royal Rumble match, it was quite difficult to pick a winner. The final four consisted of Billy Gunn, Steve Austin, The Rock and Kane, and in the end, Austin eliminated the Big Red Machine to win his third Royal Rumble, securing his spot in the WrestleMania 17 main event against Kurt Angle. At the No Way Out pay-per-view a month later, the WrestleMania main event was swiftly changed when The Rock defeated Angle to become the new WWF champion, and so we had a WrestleMania rematch on our hands. Stone Cold Steve Austin versus The Rock, one more time on the WWF's grandest stage. This one is interesting though because The Rock had, by this point, become that huge superstar we spoke about earlier. While there was a clear good guy versus bad guy dynamic at WrestleMania 15, WrestleMania 17 was way different because we now had the two most well-loved superstars in the WWF going at it for the WWF Championship. This really was all the story we needed, but the WWF decided to add Deborah McMichael, Austin's wife at the time, into the storyline build-up, and I always felt this was unnecessary. Deborah had, in storyline, shown interest in managing again, but Vince McMahon instead threw a spanner in the works by making Deborah the manager of The Rock against The Rock's wishes. Austin told Rocky that the Great One is responsible for Deborah, and if anything happens to Austin's wife, then Rock would pay for it. Of course, Deborah ended up getting hurt, so Stone Cold delivered a stunner as punishment. This led to Rocky retaliating the next week, and on the episode of SmackDown just before WrestleMania 17, Deborah was relieved of her duties by Vince McMahon. It's telling that no one really remembers this part of the WrestleMania 17 build-up. It wasn't that great, to be honest. Still, if we remove Deborah from the equation, the Rock versus Steve Austin story at WrestleMania 17 was all about proving who was the very best in the company, who should write number one in those autographs, who is the true face of the World Wrestling Federation. A sit-down interview with The Rock and Austin took place on the March 22nd, 2001 episode of SmackDown, and it's this segment that really stands out for me during this whole build-up. Austin and Rock say they professionally respect each other, but personally, neither man like one another. Austin and Rock agree that holding the WWF belt means that you're the number one guy in the industry. Rock says he will give Austin the absolute best version of The Rock at the pay-per-view, and while Austin says that The Rock brings out the best in Stone Cold, the Rattlesnake tells Rocky that Stone Cold Steve Austin needs to beat The Rock at WrestleMania. Austin says there can only be one WWF champion, and when it's all said and done, Stone Cold Steve Austin will win the WWF title at the Houston Astrodome. I personally feel you can skip the rest of the build-up and just watch this promo. Steve Austin in particular was excellent here. So we arrive at WrestleMania 17, April 1st, 2001 at the Houston Astrodome. Many fans call this the greatest WrestleMania of all time, thanks to its ridiculously stacked card, and fans also call this event the unofficial end of the Attitude Era. Vince McMahon had purchased WCW in the weeks leading up to this very show, and many feel that the tone of the WWF shifted greatly with the acquisition of WCW. But anyway, Rock and Austin are in the main event spot once again. As mentioned earlier, the whole dynamic has changed for this match. Rock and Austin are both at the very top of the WWF ladder, but there's only room for one man to reign supreme. The story going into this match with the removal of Deborah was simple. Who was the number one guy in the World Wrestling Federation? What makes it resonate though is the fact that the WWF had promoted this kind of storyline previously, but this one really was about who was the number one superstar. I think the only other WrestleMania match you could compare it to would be Hulk Hogan versus The Warrior in terms of two insanely popular babyfaces going at it in the main event. I should also mention the build-up video that aired before the main event. The WWF used Limp Bizkit's My Way to tell the story of Rock versus Austin at WrestleMania 17, and it was put together so well. The WWE struggles these days with their pre-match hype videos, but you can't watch the My Way video without wanting to watch Austin versus Rock immediately afterwards. It's actually a highlight of the whole WrestleMania 17 broadcast, and it's even been separated into its own segment on the WWE Network. Not only did the storyline differ greatly from WrestleMania 15 here, but the match was also completely different. While the no DQ stipulation at WrestleMania 15 lent itself to a lot more brawling outside the ring and a lot of referee bumps, this one here is an all-out fight from bell to bell. It's definitely the most violent Austin vs Rock WrestleMania match, and it's probably also the most gripping. Before the match begins, Howard Finkel catches everyone off guard by announcing that this match will also be a no disqualification match, just like Mania 15. Jim Ross is baffled by the decision on commentary, but still no complaints. The audience cheers at the announcement. The glass shatters and Disturbed's version of Stone Cold's theme plays in the arena. Fans are going nuts for Stone Cold in the Astrodome. The Rock gets a great ovation too, but you can definitely hear some boos after the dust settles. We are in Texas after all, so I think even Rocky expected fans to cheer for Austin more so than himself. The fans do rally behind Austin more and more as the match goes on, and it is very noticeable, but Rocky still had his own fans here at WrestleMania 17. Steve Austin is vicious throughout the match. Stone Cold's motivation of needing to win this bout is put on display as the Texas Rattlesnake goes after the People's Champion in a much more urgent manner. Rock gets busted open when Austin uses the ring bell as a weapon, but The Rock is able to return the favour by slamming Austin into an exposed turnbuckle. The turnbuckle was removed by Austin earlier in the match. The fight spills to the outside of the ring for the second time, where more punishment is dished out by both men, and a really cool spot happens when the match gets back inside. Austin goes for the stunner, but it's blocked, leading to Rocky applying the sharpshooter in a callback to Austin's match with Bret Hart at WrestleMania 13. Austin makes his way to the ropes to break the hold, and Stone Cold himself is then able to put Rocky in a sharpshooter of his own. While all of this is going on, the blood is spilling on the ring mat and the fans are going absolutely insane. They aren't letting up at all here in the WrestleMania 17 main event. Another callback takes place when Steve Austin applies the $1 Million Dream, his old finishing move when he worked as the ringmaster. Rocky hits Austin with a Stone Cold Stunner, giving us the first false finish of the match. This prompts Vince McMahon to come to ringside, and this was confusing as McMahon had shown no love to neither Austin or Rocky in the run-up to this match. Both men were enemies of Vince McMahon. It appears that Rocky has the match won after hitting the People's Elbow, but Vince McMahon interrupts the referee's 3 count. I remember watching this live and not having a clue what was going on. Vince McMahon siding with Steve Austin never seemed like a possibility to me, and it took a while for the next sequence of events to really sink in. Rock goes after Vince, but this eventually allows Austin to hit a rock bottom on the Great One, but the Rock kicks out and you can see Austin getting increasingly frustrated. Austin hits a low blow and then the unthinkable happened. This was when the penny dropped for me. Steve Austin holds the Rock up to allow Vince McMahon to strike Rocky with a chair. Still, The Rock is able to kick out. Austin is now seething with anger. The Rock dodges a chair shot from Austin and delivers the rock bottom, but Vince McMahon has the referee distracted. Austin then hits the Stone Cold Stunner, but The Rock again kicks out. The audience at this point is in an absolute frenzy and fans are getting behind The Rock. They don't want this match to end. Austin realizes that the only way to put an end to the match is by completely destroying his opponent, and that's exactly what happens. Austin cracks Rocky with a vicious chair shot, and when Rocky refuses to stay down, Austin grabs the chair and proceeds to hit Rocky 16 times, driving the chair into Rocky's midsection and striking Rock's back over and over again. Austin gets the pinfall win. Stone Cold shakes hands with Vince McMahon as Paul Heyman says on commentary that Steve Austin has sold his soul for the WWF title. Paul Heyman also says that we just witnessed something that we will talk about for years to come, and well, here we are. The decision to turn Stone Cold Steve Austin into a heel has been the subject of debate over the years. Some fans liked it, some didn't. Steve Austin himself says that, in hindsight, it was maybe the wrong move, as fans still wanted to cheer for the Rattlesnake. But in saying that, at least we got the two-man power trip out of Austin's heel turn, and along with that, we also got to see Austin play a more comedic role as his heel character continued to play out on WWF TV screens. Austin's promo work with Kurt Angle and Vince McMahon was masterful in my opinion, and without Austin turning into a bad guy, we may never have got to see some of the most legitimately funny segments on WWF programming. The Rock, meanwhile, would remain a good guy right up until the point where he was ready to take a break from the WWF to pursue his acting goals. I'm summarising a lot here, but this video was meant to only focus on the 3 WrestleMania matches, so let's jump ahead to 2003 to look at the final WrestleMania confrontation between The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin. When The Rock dropped the Undisputed Championship to Brock Lesnar at SummerSlam 2002, the crowd cheered for the next big thing, while The Rock got a harsh reception from the audience in attendance. This was because Rocky was planning on taking more time away from the WWF. The movie offers were coming in strong, and The Rock wanted to split his time between making films and wrestling in the WWE. Wrestling fans at the time felt that The Rock was choosing Hollywood over them, and the fans let Rocky know how they felt by booing him in his SummerSlam 2002 title match. When The Rock returned on the February 20th, 2003 episode of SmackDown, he came back as a heel. The Rock said that the people turned their backs on the Great One, and now The Rock doesn't need the people anymore. To kick off this new Hollywood Rock persona, the Great One had his first pay-per-view match back in the WWE against Hulk Hogan, a rematch from their WrestleMania 18 encounter. Hogan vs Rock 2 took place at No Way Out 2003, and at this very same pay-per-view, Stone Cold Steve Austin returned to face Eric Bischoff. Austin had no-showed events following WrestleMania 18, and he wasn't on good terms with the WWE, but cooler heads prevailed and Stone Cold was brought back into the company. Little did we know that Austin would only have 3 more matches upon returning in 2003. This one here against Bischoff at No Way Out, another match against Eric on Raw that Steve Austin won around 3 weeks later, and finally his WrestleMania match with The Rock. Following No Way Out, The Rock was moved over to Raw, where he failed to become the #1 contender for the World Heavyweight Championship. Rock quickly set his sights on Steve Austin, calling out Stone Cold for being voted the WWE Superstar of the Decade back in January. Austin returned to WWE Raw on the March 3rd episode, and during his promo, he was interrupted by The Rock. The Rock says that he's done it all in the WWE, but the one thing that keeps him up at night, and the one thing he never accomplished, was gaining a victory over Stone Cold Steve Austin at WrestleMania. This new cocky and brash version of the People's Champion wants to go one more time with Austin on the WWF's biggest stage, but when the challenge is laid out, Eric Bischoff interrupts the festivities. Eric wants to give Rock some options, so a match is made. If Rock can beat Booker T next week on Raw, then Rock can go ahead with the Steve Austin match, or The Rock can instead go after Triple H in the world title, something that also sounded attractive to the Great One. The Rock managed to change his opponent to the Hurricane, and thanks to Austin distracting Rocky, the Hurricane won the match. With Rock now unable to go after the world title, the Austin vs Rock match was made official. A highlight of this build-up came when The Rock put on his very first rock concert on WWE Raw. Steve Austin managed to get into the arena even though he was barred earlier in the evening, and a highly entertaining segment ended with Stone Cold destroying The Rock's prized acoustic guitar that was signed by Willie Nelson. So going into WrestleMania 19, we had another very different Rock versus Austin match. While Rock had been a heel at WrestleMania 15, this version of The Rock in 2003 was vastly different from the 1999 corporate champion. The Rock acted like the WWE was now below him. He was now a big name in the world of entertainment, and he had an unhealthy obsession with defeating Stone Cold at WrestleMania. The Rock saw himself as a complete ultra star of entertainment. He felt untouchable, and his newfound levels of confidence and attitude led to some of The Rock's finest and funniest promo work. On the flip side, things weren't going so well for Austin on a personal level. Stone Cold said that he had been living too fast, lingering injuries were creeping up on him, and Steve Austin riding off into the sunset had become a real possibility. Stone Cold spent the night before WrestleMania 19 in a hospital. He described his symptoms as an anxiety attack multiplied by 100. A mixture of liquor, too much caffeine, and not enough water was all the doctors could really say. There was nothing wrong with Austin's heart, but Stone Cold said he was terrified when the symptoms began at his hotel. Stone Cold Steve Austin wasn't medically cleared to work at WrestleMania 19, but Stone Cold said he owed The Rock. He was going into Safeco Field one way or another to do the job, and that would be his final match in the WWE. The next comment I make here will annoy people, I'm sure, but I firmly believe that The Rock carried the WrestleMania 19 match. And I don't mean this in a way that disregards Steve Austin at all. The guy was in hospital the night before Mania, so of course Rock would be expected to carry the load and make things as comfortable as possible for his opponent. It's to Steve's credit that the match still went ahead as scheduled, and that Mania match likely took way more out of Stone Cold than it did The Rock. But in terms of a viewer watching the match on television, and in terms of comparing WrestleMania 19 to WrestleManias 17 and 15, there's a much heavier focus here on The Rock's antics than ever before. This doesn't make it a bad match either. I think Austin vs Rock at Mania 19 is a great bout. I like it more than the Mania 15 match, and it fits nicely into one of the best WrestleManias the WWE ever produced. The company even went back to using Limp Bizkit for the pre-match video, but Steve Austin's physical and mental state was a huge factor in this bout, and again, if you watch all three matches back to back, you can tell Austin isn't all there. The Rock acts up during the whole match, mocking the fans in attendance, bringing offense to Stone Cold that allows Rocky to show off a little, and many people will remember The Rock putting on Steve Austin's vest and taking a complete beating afterwards. The Rock had Austin's number on this night though. Austin kicked out of 2 rock bottoms, but the rattlesnake couldn't kick out of the third. After the bell rung, things got emotional. The Rock sat beside Steve Austin and said a few words that the microphones couldn't pick up. For a while, Rocky never did say what words were spoken here, but after being asked about it during an Instagram Q&A session quite recently, The Rock revealed that he thanked Stone Cold for everything Austin had done for him, and he told his WrestleMania rival that he loved him. Clearly choked up after the match, The Rock takes a moment to see his family at ringside, and on his way back up the ramp, The Rock looks back at Austin and gives him one final nod of respect. Stone Cold gets cheered by the fans in attendance as he heads back to the locker room. None of us knew that this would be Austin's final match at the time, but this was Stone Cold's farewell match, ending one of the most groundbreaking and successful professional wrestling runs of all time. And that was The Rock and Steve Austin's WrestleMania match trilogy. What's so good about these WrestleMania bouts is that everyone has their favourite. Some fans really enjoyed the build-up of Mania 15 and the corporation versus the working man angle. Many people enjoyed the brutality and shock of WrestleMania 17. And many fans like seeing The Rock play up during WrestleMania 19 and the emotional ending to a storied rivalry. There's no wrong answer here. You don't need to pick a favourite. Each match is good for different reasons, and that's what makes the trilogy so special. Triple H and The Undertaker also had a WrestleMania match trilogy, and I'll cover that in the future, but if I'm honest, it didn't hold a candle to Stone Cold Steve Austin versus The Rock, and it's hard to imagine another 2 superstars pulling it off again in the future.